But if they're sports fans, to imagine that you're the general manager of a professional sports team. This probably resonates the most with people that are fans of American, like Major League Baseball or NFL or NBA, but basically any sport, even football, in Europe and in other regions around the world. This should resonate to a certain degree, where you're the general manager of this team. You have a certain amount of payroll. You'd love to be able to recruit like an Aaron Judge or Massey or someone like a superstar. But the problem is, if you go and you recruit that superstar, like 50% of your company's payroll may immediately be gone for that particular superstar. So do you really have enough to spread out your payroll throughout the rest of the team to get a good supporting cast of teammates to make the superstar successful? And then, of course, if that particular superstar gets injured, what happens to the rest of the teams? Hello, good afternoon, good morning. For some of you, it may even be good evening. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and I want to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live stream, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about throughout the entire data center ecosystem, regardless of whether your company is an operator like colocation, wholesale, hyperscale, maybe edge or modular. Maybe your company provides technology or facilities related products and services to the digital infrastructure, to data centers. Or perhaps your company does something related to construction or real estate or raising capital in and around the data center industry. Or maybe even your company provides some kind of outsourced sales or marketing services to the data center, digital infrastructure, mission critical industry. And regardless of the role, the job function that you have on the team, maybe you're in sales, marketing, customer success, also sometimes known as account management, product management, channel partnerships, or perhaps you're the executive sponsor, the orchestra conductor that makes everything happen together at the same time. If you're watching this live, let us know in the comments where you're joining us from and what you do in the data center industry. If you want to make sure that you stay up to date on news and resources and new events just like this, make sure you subscribe to our data center sales and marketing email newsletter that comes to your inbox every Sunday. You can subscribe to the data center sales and marketing newsletter at www.dcsmi.com. So what's on the agenda for this week's data center sales and marketing go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show? We'll start by looking at how a data center solutions provider can increase awareness. That's a huge one. I know it's one of the biggest challenges that we hear about on an ongoing basis. Then we'll turn our attention to how to prove that you're a data center subject matter expert and trusted advisor. Next, we'll shift into some discussion about how a data center asset liquidation and demolition company can get connected to decision makers, kind of probably the first cousin of a decommissioning company there. After that, we'll take a quick break for a message from our sponsor, and then we'll look at how a global data center safety provider can find clients. After that, we'll turn our attention to how to start a data center business. And then we'll head down the home stretch with some deep dive into how to grow immersion cooling business within data center and high performance computing HPC environments. So without any further delay, let's jump into this week's first question, which is, how does a data center solutions provider increase awareness? That's a great one, because we now live in a world that's more globally connected than ever before. And we also live in a world that's driven more by self-propelled buyers' journeys than ever before. If I was hosting this live stream event a decade or so ago, if I was answering this question 10 years or so ago, we would have talked about the buyer's journey. And specifically, the buyer's journey is the active research process that one of your ideal prospects or clients goes through in between when they first discover that they have a goal or a challenge or a need or a stress that they're trying to deal with, and when they actually make a purchase decision. And about 10 years ago, most buyers spent about half of the buyer's journey with your sales team, meaning they got to roughly the halfway point before they were open to a sales conversation, which still left plenty of time for your sales team to do diagnostics and exploratory and better understand what they were truly looking for and help to frame the criteria that they use to evaluate all the other options. At the time, the prevailing data, the prevailing research was often cited from CEB, the Corporate Executive Board, that's now part of Gartner. And at that time, 56%, and this research was also co-sponsored with Sirius Decisions and Salesforce, so pretty widely accepted. 56% of a typical journey was over before vendor contact, before sales contact. Those days are long, long gone. Over the course of the last 10 years, as more baby boomers have retired, and they've been replaced by even more digitally leaning Gen Xers and millennials and Gen Z, we've ended up with a much more self-propelled buyer's journey. In addition to those demographic factors, think about the first 2 years of the 2020s, when nearly everyone was working from home, which also accelerated digital transformation. So that 56% number, where roughly half of the buyer's journey was over before sales contact, is now very much in our rearview mirror. And the prevailing number today, the prevailing consensus is that about 83% of a typical buyer's journey is over before sales contact or vendor contact. In other words, your prospects, your clients, your future sources of business really don't want to spend much time with your sales team anymore until they're almost ready to purchase. What are they doing before that? They're doing tons of research and comparing options and evaluating pricing on their own. They're going to search engines, they're going to their AI assistants, they're asking questions on social media, they're posting questions to their peers and looking for feedback. They're watching webinars and live streams just like this. They're listening to podcasts. They're going to review websites. In other words, they're going everywhere possible to avoid having to spend time with members of your sales team. This sales allergy is a very, very real thing. And this isn't just edge cases. This isn't just outliers. McKinsey found that like 70 to 80% of B2B buyers now prefer a digital journey. So with all of that in mind, how does a data center solutions provider increase awareness? It comes down to understanding what exactly it is that your company does. What's on your current product and services pages on your website? What's on your product roadmap of what you plan to be providing 6 months, 12 months, maybe at the absolute most 18 months out from now? And with that in mind, who are your ideal clients? When I look at the case study section on your website, can I find commonalities? When I look at your reviews, when I look at your testimonials, can I find the common ground? And with that in mind, you should be able to back into documenting a simple one-page ideal client profile, ICP, as it's often abbreviated. And on that ICP, we're going to document for our ideal client for a data center solutions provider, where are they located? What's the geographic components of all this? Can your company truly sell globally? Can you sell to an entire continent? Or can you just sell to a specific country or a region of a certain country? It's incredibly important when you're looking to build brand awareness that you're hyper specific about the location where you're looking to build brand awareness. Because at the absolute minimum, if you're selling globally, there's potentially dozens of different languages that you'll need to create brand awareness for. Even if you're just selling to English-speaking nations, for example, there may be a lot of localization and cultural issues that come up in building your brand awareness and building your go-to-market plan. In your ideal client profile, we also need to be realistic about the company sizes that are a really good fit for you to build brand awareness as a data center solution provider. In other words, I think like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold. It's the same thing. What company size is too large to be a good fit for your company to sell products and services as a data center solution provider, and what kind of company is too small. In other words, at the upper end of the range, what company is much more likely to do what you do in-house and not have a need for a data center solution provider? And what size company is so small that they just simply wouldn't have the resources to be able to afford your minimum level of engagement? With that in mind, you should be able to come up with a band, a range of the smallest size to the largest size. And people in and around the data center industry are wired innately to think about megawatts and now gigawatts, as well as square footage and density. And those are all important. But when it comes to targeting for brand awareness, at some point, you're going to have to convert this into a company size by revenue or by number of employees. The number of employees becomes a lot more straightforward and more actionable, just simply because LinkedIn, the most popular B2B professional networking on the platform on the planet, where likely most of your buyer personas spend a significant amount of their time. LinkedIn is wired to bracket everything by number of employees, like, for example, 1 to 10 employees, 11 to 50, 51 to 200, et cetera. So once you have that in mind, it helps with your filters. It helps with your queries if you're using LinkedIn Sales Navigator. It helps with your ad strategy if you're running LinkedIn Campaign Manager. So normalizing by number of employees, by headcounts, is also incredibly important for your ideal client profile. And then in addition to the geographic factors, in addition to the company size factors, think about if there's certain business models, if there are certain industries that are a better fit than others for what you provide as a data center solutions provider. And this becomes especially relevant because we know in certain geographic regions of the world, certain regulatory requirements kick in depending on the nature of the industry, depending on the nature of the vertical business model. Like the most well-known ones, for example, would be around healthcare or financial services. But there's certainly other cases where your ability to meet compliance requirements and certification requirements definitely becomes a factor in how you are looking to build a brand awareness as part of your ideal client profile. So now that we have the company in mind, as your ICP is documented, as your ideal client profile is documented, we can set about building a target account list of a couple dozen, a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand companies that fit that really well, that we need to build a brand awareness within. Then within those companies, we need to know who are the most important kinds of stakeholders that we need to build brand awareness with, that we need to educate and build trust with. And depending on the nature of what you do, this could be CTOs, this could be facilities directors, it could be real estate directors. And again, the roles will depend on the nature of what it is that you actually provide at the intersection of their company size. Why is their company size so important with the buyer personas? Because we know in smaller companies, people tend to wear a lot of hats. They take on a lot of different roles that in larger companies could be split up among multiple different job functions, even multiple different teams. But at the end of the day, to be effective with building brand awareness as a data center solutions provider, we not only need to know the company that we're targeting, we need to know the kind of stakeholder that we're targeting. And your most important stakeholder that you need to build brand awareness with, we're going to call your primary buyer persona. The second most important one, we'll call your secondary buyer persona. There may even be a third most important one, like a tertiary buyer persona. And over time, you may encounter negative buyer personas. This could be detractors, people that aren't big fans of what you do, or stakeholders that when you come across, you know, in that particular company, that's going to be the kiss of death for being able to do business with that company because it's just an instant disqualifier. So that would be a negative buyer persona. And all of these become incredibly important for how you build your website navigation, how you target paid search, how you target paid social, what goes on the drop-down lists on your forms, the filters that your sales team uses from a sales enablement perspective and deals board perspective, and a host of other factors. But we need to directionally make sure that we're hyper-focused, that we're super clear about the kinds of companies and the kinds of stakeholders within those companies where we need to build brand awareness. Once we have that in mind, we'll go and do the research, the customer insight research, and actually do actual real live research on these buyer personas so we know their biggest goals, their biggest challenges, where they hang out online and offline, what they desire most, what's keeping them up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Once we've answered those 5, 6, 7 most important questions for our first kinds, primary and a secondary buyer personas, then we go about creating a content calendar, an events calendar, and we need to educate and build trust as if the future survival of our company depends on us educating and building trust with our most important and second most important buyer personas. That's the key to building brand awareness. What I would caution you to keep in mind is the definition of brand. Just like the buyer's journey has changed tremendously over the past 10 years, the definition of building a brand and brand awareness has changed quite drastically over the last 10 years. And in a world where you're not involved, your sales team is probably not going to be invited in very often onto the prospect or client side of the table unless they show up as a consultant, a teacher, a trusted advisor, or a subject matter expert. It becomes incredibly important to remember that your brand now, your building brand awareness, is about so much more than aesthetic factors or what would have been the domain of your creative director many years ago. It's about so much more than just the hexadecimal codes for your colors and the fonts and the logos and the trade dress. Your brand is now everything that the marketplace says about your company and your team when you are not in the room. And given that you're hardly in the room anymore for nearly all of the buyer's journey, it is incredibly important for us to get your client-facing team in as early as possible and as often as possible as trusted advisors, as teachers, as consultants, and subject matter experts. If they're just showing up, badgering prospects to book a meeting, not going to cut it anymore. No one needs your sales team to read the website to them anymore. What they do need is they do need to feel that your team brings expert insight about how other stakeholders in similar companies have tackled these problems. So to the extent they're able to provide that, they'll be welcomed in. Your prospects and clients will want to meet with them. To the extent they're not doing that, they're going to hear a lot of crickets. So really the choice is yours. But at the end of the day, if you are in a leadership role with a data center solutions provider and you're trying to increase and build your awareness, these are all really, really important factors to be thinking through for now and in the coming months and in the coming years. Next question up is, how do you prove that you are a data center subject matter expert and trusted advisor? How do you prove that you, your team, your company is comprised of subject matter experts and trusted advisors? What it largely comes down to is there are a lot of people sharing a ton of really, really selfish content on their LinkedIn profiles. In other words, you're talking about all the things that you care about and virtually none of the things that your prospects and clients care about, at least in the early and middle stages of their journey. Put it in another way, it's as if you're going to shop for a new car. You're looking to purchase or lease a new car. And your lease isn't up for another 6 or 9 months. So you're not really in an intense phase of figuring out what car you want to get next, but you're trying maybe once a month on a weekend, going out for an hour or two and sitting in some cars, checking out the legroom, finding out some pros and cons, maybe doing a test drive. Of course, we live in a world now where there's so much information at our fingertips. So using the salesperson as the to gather information and the source of information, those days are long, long gone. However, for a commission-hungry car salesperson, that doesn't necessarily stop them from trying to close every person that walks through the door on the spot. So much to the point that they totally miss the cues when you tell them, back off, we're 8 months away from our lease expiration. We're just kind of looking around. You can see our kids are really, really tall for teenagers, right? We want to make sure that everyone's got good leg room. We're concerned with comfort and safety and value and all those other factors. So we're for sure not buying today. And that last part, they're narcissistically, egotistically, whatever you want to call it, they just are incapable of hearing that you aren't buying today. And because of that, they keep badgering and nagging you to the point where eventually they burn an enormous amount of goodwill. You throw up your hands, you walk out, and you're like, I can't deal with these people. They're totally like, they're totally tone deaf. They don't get what we're looking for. They don't get that we're just at the early stages. So the problem is, as a company in and around the data center industry, you don't want to show up looking like a car salesperson. If anything, if you had to default to a useful stereotype or framework, you want to really show up looking more like a Big Four consultant, as if your expertise is so valuable that it feels like a paid enterprise consulting engagement that your client booked with EY or PwC or KPMG or Deloitte or something like that. That's the key to immediately changing the positioning of your client-facing team, regardless of whether they're account executives, sales development reps, marketers, account managers, product managers. Product folks usually don't have that problem. Channel partnerships managers, sometimes they actually do have that exact problem. So we want to make sure that we elevate the positioning of your client-facing team so that they are able to add value as a consultant, a teacher, a trusted advisor, and a subject matter expert. And that can take a while. What it will come down to for most companies is there will be certain talent on your team roster that brought a lot of institutional knowledge of your industry and of your most important buyer personas in their industries with them when they joined your company. There will be some that continue to accumulate and build on that in their tenure with your company. And then there will be complete beginners, either because they're complete beginners to the data center industry, they're complete beginners to their job, or a little bit of both. So at the end of the day, getting this right largely comes down to improving your onboarding, your upskilling, your professional development of all of your most important team members, or at the minimum, cross-pollinating the expertise of some of your more senior team members with your more junior team members. I've always said too, not everyone is going to be able to elevate all the way up to the level of being seen as a thought leader. But over time, a lot of people can be perceived as teachers and consultants. And even at the absolute minimum, a relatively new hire who's been with your company maybe for a few weeks or a few months, maybe you set the bar a little differently. Maybe you're positioning them as a tour guide, as a concierge of your company's best internal resources. So when they meet with prospects, when they meet with clients, they are phenomenal at being able to articulate the great internal resources that you have that can help this particular prospect or client get educated and learn more about how other companies have gone through this journey, how other stakeholders, how other job functions, job roles have gone through this kind of journey. And again, it is a journey. Let's be very realistic about this. There's awareness where individuals just know they have a goal or a problem that they're trying to figure out, but they don't really have a tightly defined category name or solution name. And they're certainly not looking for specific companies. So that's the awareness stage, often called the top of the funnel. The consideration stage, sometimes called the middle of the funnel, is where they've given their goal, they've given their challenge, they've given their stressor a name. And because they've given it a name, they're now in much better shape to be able to start figuring out the criteria that they're going to use to evaluate all of the options that are potentially in front of them. So at this stage, things like comparison guides, buyer's guides, webinars, where you spend more time with prospects and clients, can be incredibly impactful in this middle stage and in this consideration stage. And decision stage, if your company is completely new to most of this, that's usually the place where most companies will get a passing grade, even if they're completely dropping the ball in the awareness and the consideration stage. The problem is, though, is most of your prospects are nowhere near the decision stage. In fact, most industry experts can see that only about 5 or 10% of your market is ready for sales contact at any given point in time. Like 95% of the people that you come across could be a fantastic fit for your company a couple weeks, a couple months, maybe several months later, but they're not ready now. And if you force your selfish agenda on them, all you're going to do is burn goodwill and pretty much guarantee that you will not be on the short list when they're actually ready to start looking at these issues. So we need to meet prospects and clients where they actually are, not where we want them to be. So we have the awareness, the consideration, and the decision stages of their buyer's journey, their active research process that they go through between the itch of a problem that they have or an aspirational goal and their ultimate purchase decision. And there can be as many as 28 touch points that need to happen in between complete stranger and purchase decision. Most companies in and around the data center space, if they're doing well, are in on maybe 1 or 2 or 3, perhaps a maximum of 4 of these 28 touch points. And that's an enormous problem. And this is an especially pronounced problem for companies that spend a disproportionate amount of their marketing and sales budget on field events, on huge, really, really expensive conferences, multi-day national and global conferences where obviously adjust for your local currency, but where it's not uncommon to find that companies are spending anywhere from like $80,000 to hundreds of thousands of dollars by having several team members attend, staff a booth, throw cocktail parties, receptions, what have you. And if you're a very well capitalized, large enterprise business, and you have very strong unit economics where an average sale is worth hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, that can be worthwhile. However, just remember that no matter how epic your cabana party is poolside in Las Vegas, no matter how amazing the golf tournament is that you sponsored, each of those only counts for 1 of the 28 touch points. So let that sink in for a minute. What that means is even if you're planning on doing that event 364 days later at that particular conference's incarnation the following year, you still need to figure out 26, 27 other ways to stay top of mind with that prospect or client throughout the next 12 months between now and when they're ready to purchase. So in a lot of ways, I tell people that if they're sports fans, to imagine that you're the general manager of a professional sports team. This probably resonates the most with people that are fans of American, like Major League Baseball or NFL or NBA, but basically any sport, even football in Europe and in other regions around the world. This should resonate to a certain degree where you're the general manager of this team. You have a certain amount of payroll. You'd love to be able to recruit like an Aaron Judge or Massey or someone like a superstar. But the problem is, if you go and you recruit that superstar, like 50% of your company's payroll may immediately be gone for that particular superstar. So do you really have enough to spread out your payroll throughout the rest of the team to get a good supporting cast of teammates to make the superstar successful? And then, of course, if that particular superstar gets injured, what happens to the rest of the team? So that's the way I'd encourage you to think about your coverage with these touch points is, do you have enough budget to be able to spread it around so you can cover the other 26, 27 touch points beyond the epic field marketing event that you are doing? And a lot of the good news is a lot of that coverage coincides with your need to be seen as a consultant, teacher, trusted advisor, and subject matter expert, because a lot of what's incredibly important is showing up in the awareness and the consideration stages. And instead of showing up as a transaction-focused, commission-hungry, client-facing member of your sales or account manager team, that those individuals are in turn showing up as teachers, trusted advisors, and subject matter experts. And even if there aren't people on your team that are incredibly strong in those areas, they should be involved as facilitators, as moderators, as hosts. So for example, let's say that you have a mid-level sales director who knows the industry reasonably well, but probably can't carry doing 12 educationally rich, content-rich subject matter expert webinars over the course of the next 12 months. Maybe they can do 2 or 3 of those solo, but what they do have is you have an amazing list of clients. You have an amazing list of industry contacts where you can invite those folks to come on a webinar as panelists. So instead of sending your chief revenue officer, your sales director into an industry conference where you pitch them moderating a panel at a conference, they're basically doing the same thing virtually on a webinar and on a live stream. And you get an amazing halo of social proof that comes along with that. As the industry expert, as the moderator, obviously they'll help to invite their friends and coworkers and contacts along with that as well. There's social proof element. They get a tremendous amount of value from participating and getting to know the other panelists. You can record the webinar, you can repurpose it lots and many different ways. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of different ways to show up as the subject matter expert and the trusted advisor. But what it comes down to is having a healthy respect for the way that people now research and make their purchase decisions. And once you get past the notion that spending most of your time begging for meetings is a good idea, and it's actually not, the reality is you're far better off spending most of your time getting the right people to attend an educational webinar or an offline version of that as a breakfast seminar, lunch and learn symposium or something like that. Any place where you're getting the perfect people to see someone from your team as the go-to expert, because that alone can drive tremendous sales acceleration. And to the extent that one or more of your delighted clients comes along with that expert and helps to participate in that conversation, or is there in the networking or in part of the interview, enormous social proof with sales accelerators. But it largely comes down to having a healthy self-respect for their changes in buyer preferences, going deep into understanding the customer insight, researching and building out their buyer personas, and building this really deep content, editorial strategy, event strategy that's focused on positioning your team to be seen as the go-to experts in your space about anything and everything to do with what you do for those particular buyer personas in the data center industry. Next question up is, how does a data center asset liquidation and demolition company get connected to decision makers? So your company provides asset liquidation and demolition, probably pretty similar to decommissioning, in and around data centers, and you want to get connected to decision makers. What it first comes down to is recognizing that the idea of getting this magic connection that exempts you from having to do all of the other things that competitive companies in your industry are doing today is absurd. There is no shortcut. It's about the same shortcut as if I said to you, I've never been able to jog more than a mile or two, but next week I'm going to run a marathon, because there's a magic connect to marathon algorithm that's going to allow me to go from having the stamina of jogging for 15 or 20 minutes to being able to jog a marathon for 4 or 5 hours. And it's going to happen next week because there's this magic API, there's this magic service, there's this magic package that's going to accelerate all of that. If only. The reality is it's really important to understand your business model. It's critical to understand the kinds of companies that you've been successful with in the past. For most companies that do like asset liquidation and demolition in and around the data center industry, you probably have a pretty healthy list of past clients. You probably brag about these logos on your website, maybe have some case studies up on your website. And I'd encourage you to think about what your biggest success stories have in common. Because once you have an idea of what those biggest success stories have in common, you can document a simple one-page ideal client profile, where these companies are located, how big they are or how small they are, what's their headcount, square footage, how many locations, and you can figure out, are there certain industries where you've been more successful than others? In other words, are there places where you have expert competency, certifications, where you're really good with compliance and certain kinds of things like healthcare related data centers, financial services related data centers, or in those particular instances, do you get knocked out really early on because you don't meet the requirements of what they're looking for? That helps you to get a tremendous amount of clarity of what your ideal client is going to look like and goes into your simple one-page ideal client profile. From there, you should be able to build out a targeted account list of the couple dozen, couple hundred, couple thousand companies that fit that ICP, that fit that ideal client profile. From there, that can power a lot of different things that you're doing. But at the end of the day, we're not done when we know the companies. We need to know who within those companies are the decision makers. And as a starting point, we're going to go back and look at where you've been most successful in those case studies, in those logos that are up on your website. What are the job titles and job roles that you interacted with on a regular basis before, during, and post-purchase? From there, we should start to get a consensus on who the most important economic stakeholder is, who the second most important economic stakeholder is. Perhaps there's other kinds of stakeholders beyond the primary and secondary that get involved in the conversations, but generally aren't major factors. Once we know that, we can designate a primary and a secondary buyer persona, and we can go out and do the research on what makes these folks tick, what drives their decision making. What are their biggest goals? What are their biggest challenges? Where they hang out online and offline? And we need to get this insight in their own words, not what we think those words probably are, but what those words actually are. Because the difference between doing the actual research and getting the language and the messaging right versus relying on Bob, who's been selling to these companies for 27 years, to pull this out of thin air and tell you, based on Bob's experience, what they actually say. Okay, so Bob is a veteran for sure. He has a lot of value to your company, a lot of value to your clients. And I would tell you that Bob should probably be about 20%, 25% of your input. Actually, Bob as a placeholder for all of your internal input, among your CEO, among your head of customer success, your CMO, your board, whoever you're pulling this internal input from. Your internal input should be about 20 or 25%. The other 75, 80% of this customer insight research has to come from actual research. If you can do this in person, face-to-face, it's the best. Second best, fire up your Zoom account and your Calendly and book some 20 or 30-minute sessions to interview them. You can run surveys. At the absolute minimum, the better than nothing, but not ideal, is you can look at a stack of their LinkedIn profiles. You can figure out 10 or 20 representative people and go and look at their LinkedIn profiles and put the same people's first, last, and company name into a Google search and figure out how they describe themselves. On LinkedIn, that's fantastic because you'll know they'll have written a headline, they'll have written a summary about themselves, how they describe their jobs. Look at that consensus on that. Look at that'll help you give you consensus on their biggest goals. It'll help you get back into consensus on their biggest challenges, the groups, the skills identifiers, the certifications. And obviously, if you're coming across a couple of LinkedIn profiles and you can tell that they have like 37 connections and they don't have an active profile picture, and it looks like they haven't been on LinkedIn in years, you obviously disregard that and keep looking for people that have a more robust LinkedIn profile that you can use for research purposes. Why LinkedIn so much, by the way? Because when it comes to most things in and around the data center, over the last several years, it's now come into focus that LinkedIn is the predominant B2B professional networking platform that's relevant to internal champions about digital infrastructure, data centers, mission critical type of environments. Yeah, there will be outliers who say they feel in their career that they don't need to do this, but those outliers tend to be in the 9th or 10th inning or 11th or 12th inning of their careers. They're probably not real focused on professional development or growth or networking, because in a lot of ways, with 1 billion members now worldwide, LinkedIn has become the 724 365 conference that doesn't stop. So that can be a great source of insider research to helping you get inside the minds of decision makers and how you can add a lot of value. And then from there, you'll start to map into what the decision committee looks like. There's no such magic connection to a decision maker anymore in 90% of the instances. Even if you manage to get the attention of the CEO or CTO or the CIO or CFO or something like that, they're inevitably going to send you back to their team to go build consensus amount. So let's just dispel the myth that there is a magic decision maker. It's usually a decision committee. And that decision committee is ideally suited to being receptive to education that helps them do their job better when it comes to anything and everything having to do with asset liquidation and demolition. So your goal should be to be the most world-renowned, most preeminent, best, well-known leader of expertise around anything and everything having to do with data center, asset liquidation, and demolition. And you can do this through blogs, podcasts, webinars, research reports. But at the end of the day, those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision, your goal is to monopolize and dominate, so much to the point that there's virtually no room for anyone that competes with you to get a word in edgewise, because you've completely crushed it when it comes to educating and building trust with members of the decision committee. So how do you get members, plural, to be talking about you and spreading your expertise? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. Let's say, for example, you decide to invest in a monthly webinar program or a bi-weekly webinar program or whatever you think will work best to accomplishing the touchpoint goals. For starters, on the webinar registration form, as you've likely seen with DCSMI, we have a write-in field asking every person their biggest sales and marketing challenge. So your version would be, what's your biggest question about or your biggest struggle when it comes to data center asset liquidation and demolition? Get them to write that in their own words. Obviously, that goes into your CRM, so it's like gold for your sales team to understand what's top of mind for that particular person. And the consensus on 4, 5, 6 of those across the decision committee in a particular company is also gold for telling you what their priorities are. So that's thing number one. Thing number two that's incredibly impactful is when they register for your webinar, when they register to watch the recording, when they register to download your free ebook or your planning guide or your state of research report or whatever you're doing, they get a message back that delivers and confirms and says, who else should attend? Who else should watch this? Who else should be reading this? You know, when it comes to data center asset liquidation and demolition, it truly takes a village. In most companies, there's typically people involved from this team, this department, this job role, that department. So with that in mind, is there anyone else on your team who should also be attending this, watching this, reading this? If so, simply hit the forward button and let them know why this matters. You'd be shocked at how the simple email marketing automation that you've been able to do for 20 years, how effective it still works. Because it is not the same as someone putting their neck out on the line and endorsing your company. All it's doing is saying, hey, Bob, hey, Sally, I found this great webinar. I think you'll find it valuable too. I found this great downloadable guide. I think our team could really use it. And you'll know this is working in 2 different ways. For starters, you'll know it's working because you look down at HubSpot or whatever you're using to keep track of this, and you're like, oh my gosh, there's like 6, 7, 8 people from the same company who've all converted on our landing page in the last 30 minutes or an hour. They're talking about us. And that's the goal, is to get them talking about you and your expertise. And you'll know it's really working because by the time you go out to meet with that prospect or client the first time, you'll discover that they used their methodology as free consulting. They used your methodology to set up the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the other options that were in front of them. So your content, your thought leadership, your education and trust building that you did through your downloadables, through your podcast, through your webinars, through your live streams, through all of this stuff in aggregate with controlling as many of those 28 touch points as possible, not only got you onto the short list, not only ensured that you stayed on the short list throughout the buyer's journey because you stayed with multiple stakeholders from the same company in an educational context throughout their buyer's journey. In some cases, in a lot of cases, it not neutralizes and knocks out many or most of the competitive options to the point where the short list can sometimes even collapse down into your company being the last person that's left on the short list before that initial meeting. And you imagine how awesome that initial sales meeting is when you go in and they're quoting you in their methodology and their priorities, and someone accidentally lets it slip that, yeah, this is the reason why they're not talking to anyone else at this point. Fish in a barrel. So if you're serious about your data center asset liquidation and demolition company being seen as the go-to experts in your space and getting connected to the right decision makers to put amazing deals up on your deals board, into your pipeline that close into amazing sources of new clients and revenue growth, this is the playbook going forward. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry.
To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
Hey, it's Joshua Feinberg here again from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We are all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. And you are watching our weekly Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. What's next? Next up, we're going to talk about how a global data center safety provider can provide clients. So your company is a global provider, global safety provider in and around the data center industry, and you're looking to find new clients. It's a great question. So what it first comes down to is we need to understand what kinds of data centers have you been most successful with. Because you're global, by very definition, you're going to likely have a pretty complex go-to-market strategy, a pretty complex go-to-market playbook, because the first question you'll likely need to answer is where you need to translate, where you need to localize with your sales and marketing. And that'll have implications on your marketing, your messaging, your customer insight, who you hire, what they actually do, the buyer's journey, all of that stuff. But at the minimum, for a large enterprise company that has the resources to be able to sell safety products and services in and around the data center industry on a global basis, you'll be indicating global on your ideal client profile. And because of that, it's incredibly important to make sure that you actually have the resources to do this well, to execute marketing, sales, account management, product management, channel partnerships, service delivery, finance, operations, everything that's necessary to be able to execute and grow your business globally. Second, you need to understand what size data centers you've been most successful selling to globally. If you have the resources to sell globally, you likely may not have any size problems delivering to the largest of the large. Maybe you're able to sell your safety products and services all the way up to companies as huge as like Equinix or Digital Realty or NTT or something like that. However, with that in mind, there may be a floor, there may be a minimum size that a company needs to be able to afford your minimum level of engagement, to afford your minimum level of products or services. So there may still be a size component that becomes relevant. Maybe data center related businesses with fewer than 50 employees, fewer than say 5 million in US revenue or their local currency equivalent. Maybe they're just not going to be able to have the resources to engage your company. So you'll have a geographic component, you'll have a size component, and then maybe there's certain industries where your approach is better suited than others, especially when it comes to safety, which is the first cousin of compliance and certifications and things along those lines. So perhaps your company has deep expertise in financial services, but you're not particularly strong in healthcare or something like that. So all of that will come into play as you develop your go-to-market strategy, is understanding the geographic footprint and whether you truly have the resources to market, sell, and service on a global basis, potentially in a dozen languages or more, localized in a dozen or more different instances with your messaging and with your sales and services team and delivery team. Then there's the size component, and then there's the business model, vertical, industry kind of components. Once you know that, it becomes much easier to figure out in each of these regions, for each of these playbooks, who are the most important kinds of stakeholders that you want to engage with. Is there a safety executive? Is it a facilities executive? Is it a COO? Is it a CFO? Is it an ESG? Is it a compliance person? Only you can answer that, and that's largely going to come from studying where you've been most successful. It's going to come from looking in your CRM, your customer relationship management system, looking at your case studies, and figuring out who are the typical kinds of stakeholders that are most impactful to the relationship that you have with that particular company. The most important kind of stakeholder you would designate as your primary buyer persona. The second most important would be your secondary buyer persona. And maybe in an enterprise, there's a third category of stakeholder that you need to be building a relationship with. And how are you building a relationship with this person and today and going forward on a regular basis? It's recognizing that most people are more sales allergic than ever. And most buyers want a self-guided, self-propelled buyer's journey more than ever. They will be willing to speak with your sales team, but only when they're very, very close to a purchase decision. Gartner found that number most recently to be about 83%, meaning that most of your buyers are typically about 83% of the way through their buyer's journey before they're open to having vendor contact, before they're open to having a conversation with your sales team. So it is incredibly important that your company figure out a way to get in early and get in there often. And not as a transaction-focused, commission-hungry salesperson, but being seen, being perceived, repositioning your client-facing team to be seen as teachers, trusted advisors, subject matter experts, consultants, and perhaps even thought leaders. And the way you're able to do that, in addition to rethinking your team showing up as like Big Four consultants, is your team needs to show up and be able to educate and build trust at scale with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context. How do you know that you're sending in the right people to do this education and trust building? How do you know that you're talking about the right topics? Because you're not going to wing it. You're going to do the actual research. You're actually going to go out and build and refine your buyer personas. So you know what are their biggest goals, what are their biggest challenges, what causes them to prioritize a certain kind of initiative, what's stressing them out to no end, what's causing them to have to work nights and weekends when that's not their normal hours, what's causing their vacations to get compromised, all of these things. Once you know the consensus on this, it's way easier to develop a content and events calendar that allows you to have an active role in as many of those 28 touch points as possible between complete stranger and purchase decision when it comes to anything and everything having to do with your safety products. But at the end of the day, this is a top-down cultural, company culture, major initiative that has to start with executive leadership. Someone in an executive sponsor level role of your company that has oversight over the whole go-to-market team across sales, marketing, account management, product, channel partnerships needs to say that, hey, going forward, we are going to be perceived as the go-to experts in our space when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center safety. It's up to you to figure out the playbook that you want to use, but just understand most of your buyer personas are preferring to ask questions on search and on their AI assistants. They're preferring to post questions on social media to their peers who they trust far more than vendors. They're preferring to watch YouTube videos, listen to podcasts, attend webinars, attend educational events, review websites. All of these things are incredibly impactful on the early and the middle stages and even part of the late stages of the buyer's journey. And for many companies that built their sales and marketing playbooks decades ago and really haven't done a major overhaul in the last several years, this in many ways could be long overdue because this isn't new. You're not going to be the first company on the block who says, gee, we should create some great webinars around data center safety. There's going to be competition. However, if you bury your head in the sand, I can assure you that you will not be in the consideration set most of the time going forward. So if you want to position your company to be seen as the go-to experts in your space, if you want to find the right clients in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center safety, it's time to get serious about showing up where they are, not where you'd like them to be, but where they actually are right now, so you can educate and build trust with them and stay with them throughout the buyer's journey. So you're nearly guaranteed a place on the short list throughout their research and decision making. And if you do this right, you will establish the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the competitive options. And in many cases, when you do this exceptionally well, your educational content helps to start gradually knocking out competitive alternatives because they're not showing up and you are. That's the key to all of this, is showing up early and often and being seen as a teacher, a trusted advisor, a subject matter expert, consultant, and a thought leader when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center safety. Okay, so the next question is, how do we start a data center related business? How do we start a data center related business? So at DCSMI, we actually get dozens of questions a month from people that are looking to start data center related businesses. And when they just say data center related businesses, it's really hard to know what they actually mean because the data center ecosystem is so broad and varied. You have the data center operators, for example, co-location data centers, hyperscale, edge, wholesale, modular. You also have enterprise data centers, but a data center related business likely is not an enterprise data center. It's a data center operator. Or it could be a data center related business that is a technology company or a facilities related company or construction or perhaps real estate or real estate investment related, or in some cases, outsourced sales and marketing for data center related businesses. Usually when I get that kind of question, it's from someone that's looking to start something related to being a data center operator, data center technology or facilities, or data center construction and real estate. Most often, it has to do with something related to being a data center operator, or specifically like co-location or facilities. But a lot of people also come to us that are starting data center related businesses that have something to do with facilities or technology. Just got a couple of requests this morning for exactly that for someone. I think it was something cleaning related in and around the data center space. So what it largely comes down to is you first have to figure out your lane. You first have to figure out your business model. What are you actually going to be providing and for who? That's a big one. And it's not a given that everyone knows that when they start up. Like a lot of entrepreneurial ventures, the spark of what leads to starting a business often comes from the founder's previous job. They got really good at doing something. They've left their current employer. For whatever reason, they've decided now that they're going to provide those products or those services on a outsourced basis to other similar kinds of companies. Nothing especially earth-shattering with business models. IT professionals and different kinds of knowledge worker kind of functions have been doing this for decades. That's why it's so common that you see people early on in their career that would work for like a Big Four consulting or Big Four accounting firm. And then after a few years, they decide to go out and start their own. And I see people doing this in IT roles and facilities roles and construction and real estate all of the time within the data center industry. So sometimes it's coming from there. Sometimes it's coming from an untapped market. I also get quite a few people that reach out to us that are coming at this from an investment perspective. They've been drinking the Kool-Aid, watching a lot of CNBC, a lot of Bloomberg, reading a lot of Wall Street Journal, and they're really bullish on the data center industry. Really, really bullish on the data center industry. And they want a piece of like the NVIDIA rocket ship. They want in on the action. So they're looking to deploy capital, but they really don't know very much about construction or operations or technology or facilities. And certainly very, very little about the sales and marketing part of it. That's where they tend to come to DCSMI for expertise around defining go-to-market strategy, finding growing client, building a business. But there's usually, in that scenario, there's massive gaps where they really need to go out and find a CTO, a head of facilities. There's 3-4 people that are often missing. A very common scenario too that we see in established co-location businesses is certification being a trigger for needing a bigger team. So what does that mean? So you have to have an idea of who your ideal client is going to be. You have to have an idea of what your products and services are going to be. And you should be having a lot of conversations with people that align with who you think your ideal clients are. And you could be having these conversations informally. You could be setting up Zooms. You could be going to conferences. One of my favorite tactics is starting a podcast where you interview your ideal kinds of clients, and you're like double, triple dipping. You're getting 3 or 4 jobs done at once. You're building rapport with people, relationships that could either end up being clients or referral sources in the near future. You're learning a ton of insights that on an individual level and on an aggregate level will help to shape your segmentation strategy, your targeting strategy, and your overall go-to-market strategy. You're creating events that you can invite other people to if you're live streaming or hosting these as webinars, even if you're recording them offline, as we currently do with the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, is you create great evergreen content that you can release on YouTube and on all the audio podcast distribution sites. You can chop that up and repurpose it into pieces and segments for your blog and shorter videos. You can chop it up in even smaller pieces and create shorts and reels and things like that. So there's many, many different values from that, but it's a tool where you're at the same time you're growing visibility, you're learning and you're refining and you're becoming, it's coming a lot more into focus what the biggest priorities are of your intended audience. In a lot of ways, there is still quite a difference between interviewing people in a podcast or a webinar scenario for like content marketing or thought leadership compared to like a product management context where you're looking to get at customer insight research. Typically for customer insight research where there's really no publicity angle in it for them, they're either doing these interviews as a favor to you because of a relationship or referral, or in some cases there's some compensation involved, like a gift card or something like that. For podcast interviews or webinars, there's a lot of people that just love publicity. So to the extent that you're able to offer them an opportunity to get visibility in front of your audience that you're growing, your YouTube, your blog, your email newsletter, your social, your LinkedIn presence, whatever, there's a lot of people that are really into it for that. And then there's also a way to aggregate 2, 3, 4 people together that you think would really hit it off well and invite them to be on a panel where you live stream a webinar panel and you interview those individual stakeholders, or you do this on a webinar platform or even offline. There's a lot of value in being able to hold offline breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, or even go to other event producers and propose this as a session that you can moderate as a breakout session or something like that. But this allows you to get customer insight while you're building your brand and visibility, learning, and growing reach at the same time. So those are some of the things that I would think about with starting a data center business. At the end of the day, the goal is to use your marketing and sales engine to accelerate the race to product market fit. Product market fit is like a growth stage or a maturity stage of your business where it starts to come into focus and you know exactly who your ideal clients are, the products and services they purchase from you, the price points that they purchase those from you, how frequently they purchase, or the duration if it's a recurring kind of agreement. In other words, you get a lot of clarity around what your unit economics actually are, what an average client is worth, like lifetime value of a client, what it costs you to acquire that client in terms of soft costs and hard costs with marketing and sales, profit margin, sales cycle length. Once you have clarity around those and you start to see the pattern recognition, you have what's known as product market fit, PMF. And for anyone that's ever worked as a product manager or on a product team in a company, they obsess about this. And if you've ever been part of a technology company or a SaaS company, software as a service company, your CFO also will obsess about unit economics at the same time they work with your product teams and the rest of the go-to-market teams on figuring these things out. But those are some of the really important considerations. Once you have product market fit, the next big growth milestone is usually moving beyond founder-led sales to actually growing and scaling a sales team. And that will, once you figure out with high levels of certainty where you can deploy more capital, we can add more capital into the business and know that you're going to continue to grow and scale and the wheels aren't going to fall off with customer retention and customer satisfaction, you've achieved go-to-market fit, GTMF. These, again, are some of the really, really important considerations when you're thinking about starting a data center related business. But before you do any of that, I'd encourage you to take the hop on, hop off bus tour, so to speak, of all the different sectors or segments within the data center industry. So you really understand the ecosystem, the different kinds of operators, the couple dozen different kinds of technology companies. Over on DCSMI, we actually have an ebook called the 22 Data Center Technologies that you should know about for growing your career in and around this space. There's a dozen or so facilities kind of companies to think about in a similar kind of consideration set. But again, think about someone as like a tour guide, as a tram operator in a theme park where they're taking you around the park to show you a little bit of all of these different areas. I think that would really serve you well as it starts to come into focus what kind of data center related business that you're going to start, even if it's being inspired by past career experiences by you or one of your co-founders, to figure out exactly where your company fits into the ecosystem. It will serve you incredibly well as you start to think about your go-to-market, as you think about the copywriting for the 1.0 version of your website, the different pages to put up, the different segmentation strategy, how to educate and build trust, grow demand, all of those factors are incredibly important to understand actually where you fit into your ecosystem, where you fit into the ecosystem, what your ideal client is going to look like, what the buyer personas are going to look like that you need to build a relationship with. But yeah, for sure, you're in the right place. Keep listening to our podcast, our Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. Keep watching these data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A live streams. It'll give you a tremendous education to be thinking about as you look to start and grow your data center related business. And that brings us to our final question that we're going to address in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live stream. Actually, we got one write-in question too that I'm going to address before we dive into the last formal question on this week's agenda. This person said, "Great video, thanks. Can you also talk about data center commissioning? Thank you. I am a service delivery manager for a data center commissioning." So I don't know specifically what you are looking for with data center commissioning, but like at a high level, data center commissioning is what happens in between when a data center is built and when a data center is ready to turn the lights on and be fully operational. And there typically are anywhere from a dozen to several dozen different vendors that are involved in coordinating as the data center is fit out, built out, whatever you want to call it, commissioned, that need to be coordinated. And there's a massive amount of testing that goes into place to make sure that the data center is truly ready for operations. There's an opposite scenario too of where a data center is at end of life and there's decommissioning. But yeah, commissioning for sure is a very high value business, very long consideration set, very high value type of sale that is being made where there's a lot of trust involved. And the nature of the relationships that you have with all different kinds of companies within the ecosystem is incredibly important for referral sources as well. So I would encourage you for building, if you're doing outsourced data center commissioning, to think about all the different kinds of businesses and the kinds of stakeholders that you want to build relationships with over time. For sure, in other parts of the data center ecosystem, this would be companies that do design and build, construction companies. These would be anyone that's involved in data center real estate, DCRE, or REITs, real estate investment trusts, are heavily involved in leading indicators of the need for commissioning. And in many cases, you need to plant the seeds months or years before you're actually going to sell these large data center commissioning projects, just because there's so much lead time in the planning and commission. And then you also have to figure out like where you're ideally suited to do these commissioning projects geographically. Can you truly be global, or is there a certain country or region of a country where you're ideally suited to be doing these commissioning projects? Are there certain sizes of data centers where you're a great fit, but not others? Are you best at edge or small co-location data centers? Are you ideally suited for massive hyperscale projects? Are there certain industries, business models where you're better suited than others for data center commissioning? So there's a lot that comes into play with understanding, being self-aware of your capabilities, of your team's expertise, of your capital, what you can do today versus where you want to be several months or a couple of years down the road. But if you position yourself as a service delivery manager in a company that is looking to provide outsourced data center commissioning, a lot of the relationships that you would likely have working for another company providing service delivery as part of data center commissioning, those relationships to a certain degree should be reasonably portable. This is the value of connecting with people on LinkedIn and always building your personal brand and everything. But at the end of the day, the data center ecosystem is very vast, and there's certain kinds of operators and technology and facilities and construction and real estate companies that are going to be more conducive to others for being great sources of referrals to you, for building brand awareness with, for perhaps collaborating on co-marketing initiatives like having an interview-based podcast or interview-based webinars or offline versions of those, breakfast seminars, lunch and learn symposia, where you invite different experts in that are adjacent to data center commissioning and host these great educational events that position you as a sphere of influence, as a go-to expert in the space. All of those can be tremendously powerful for building a data center commissioning business. But at the end of the day, you really need clarity, especially as a new business, as a startup, on where to begin. And that usually comes from your past LinkedIn profile experience, where you've been most successful and looking to establish that as a beachhead. So hopefully I got most of the context here of mentioning data center commissioning, the sales and marketing considerations around data center commissioning, especially as a service delivery manager that is looking to get into having their own data center commissioning related business. I probably don't need to tell you that it's a very competitive space because it's a very lucrative space. So yeah, by all means, you definitely want to build up your professional brand and understand that we're in a very different journey than we were, buyer's journey than we were 10 years ago. And you need to make sure that you show up early and often in the right places at the right time and in the right context, so that you're seen as the go-to expert on anything and everything having to do with data center commissioning, and specifically the service delivery aspect of data center commissioning. Okay, so that was kind of the bonus question for this week. So now let's jump into the final question for this week. So the final question that we'll be addressing in this week's live stream is how to grow immersion cooling. How to grow an immersion cooling business within the data center and high performance computing environment. So your company specializes in immersion cooling, things getting dipped in liquid, which 10 years ago would have seemed crazy, right? I remember I used to go on data center tours and you're forbidden from having a cup of coffee or even a sealed bottle of water anywhere near the data halls. But you're looking to grow an immersion cooling business within the data center and high performance computing HPC environments. That's a great question, and it's certainly really, really top of mind as the explosion of demand for all things related to artificial intelligence and high performance computing continues to grow. There is an enormous demand for figuring out the cooling issues and figuring out the sustainability issues. And there's a lot of companies all over the world that are working on super fascinating solutions to this. Obviously, immersion cooling is one of the dominant solutions to addressing many of these needs. So in order to do this the right way, you first need to figure out your product and service capabilities. In other words, when I look at your website, does this accurately reflect what you're going to market and sell and deliver today? Or does that need to reflect more of what you're talking about in the conversations with your sales team and your leadership? What's on your decks that you're using? What's talked about in these conversations? What's on your proposals? If it's not currently reflected on your website pages, that a complete stranger could learn more about your immersion cooling business, I'd encourage you to stop the presses and make it a priority to keep that current. Why is it so important for your website to be so current? Because we now live in a world where most of the journey is happening without you in the room, without your team in the room. Gartner found that 83% of a typical journey, including immersion cooling, now happens before vendor contact, before sales contact. That means that your best prospects, your best clients are 83% of the way through their decision-making before they're open to having a meeting with someone from your company. And this is a big difference from as recently as 10 years ago, when that number hovered at 56%. So it used to be around 10 years ago that prospects and clients would spend time with your sales team starting about halfway through their research and decision-making process. Now, nearly all of the decision-making process is over before you're in the room. So your content needs to do a lot of the heavy lifting that used to be done in one-on-one face-to-face conversations. Your content needs to show up. This changes the very definition of what we mean by branding and growing a business with immersion cooling in and around data centers and HPC. What do we mean by branding? Well, it used to be that branding was something that lived within the domain of your creative director. And they talked about your hexadecimal codes, your brand colors, your logos, your fonts. Now your brand is really anything and everything that people are saying about you when you're not in the room, that the marketplace is saying about your business, about your company, about your team when you're not in the room. And given that you're really not in the room for much of the buyer's journey anymore, you're excluded from the first 83% of the buyer's journey before you're able to get invited in and get a seat at the table, even if you do everything perfectly. Your content, your educational resources, your events are your best chance to earn a virtual seat at the table in the awareness and the consideration stages of the journey. In a typical journey for something like immersion cooling, there could be as many as 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision. That means you could have an amazing display at a conference where you're demoing your immersion cooling capabilities right on the expo floor. And you could have great rapport with a prospect. And that still is only one of the 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision. So if you're thinking that your sales team will stay in touch and they'll see you at next year's event and everything, I don't know that that's going to necessarily work out for you. If your salesperson is going to stay in touch, I would recommend that your salesperson show up as a teacher, as a consultant, as a trusted advisor, as a subject matter expert, and a thought leader when it comes to anything and everything having to do with immersion cooling. And if your account executives or if your sales development reps don't have anywhere near the knowledge to pull off being a thought leader, I would encourage you to position those team members to show up as tour guides, as concierges that are able to point your best prospects and clients in the direction of your most knowledgeable internal subject matter experts that your best prospects and clients want access to in some way, shape, or form. And if it's not practical for hundreds or thousands of prospects to have one-on-one access to the be-all end-all expert or experts on your team within immersion cooling, there's a couple of approaches to this. One is a train the trainer kind of approach, where your internal experts train your account managers and account executives and sales developers and marketers and product and everyone else that's client facing to extract parts of their knowledge over time into their knowledge base by internal training webinars, professional development kind of webinars. And this can be codified, formalized into a training curriculum, virtual lunch and learns or something like that. You could check to make sure that people are really absorbing it by having a knowledge and certification program internally. In addition to training your internal team members to keep leveling up on their knowledge on anything and everything having to do with immersion cooling, your marketers, your sales enablers can bring your subject matter experts into the fold in an education and trust building context. So let's say, for example, you want to grow your immersion cooling business and you recognize that it's incredibly important for you to have relationships with CTOs and facilities directors of co-location data centers or edge data centers or whatever, enterprise data centers, whatever you're looking to do this with. So you go and you do their buyer persona research and you figure out what their biggest goals, what their biggest challenges are at the intersection of their job role, their company's goals, their company's challenges, and what you do with immersion cooling. That customer insight research gets baked into a content calendar. It gets baked into an events calendar. And all of a sudden now you have 12 topics to cover in your monthly webinar series on Immersion Cooling Academy, Immersion Cooling University. And sure, there are huge companies in the space that are knocking it out of the park doing some things like this. But I can assure you, you don't necessarily need to have the resources anywhere near a company like Schneider or Vertiv or someone like that to be able to pull off being an expert on things related to data center sustainability or AI or anything that you want to tackle that's adjacent to immersion cooling. So you can look at some of the bigger incumbents in your space that are doing amazing jobs on creating thought leadership and events about sustainability and power grid capacity and cooling and everything like that. But I can assure you there are companies with fewer than 10 employees that are figuring out ways to create these amazingly impactful podcasts and live streams and webinars that educate and build trust with their target market. So even if there's only one person on your entire team that is like at a quasi PhD level on immersion cooling, you can almost certainly get that person to commit to showing up once a month to be the guest expert on a webinar. You can likely get that person to agree to show up every other week, where on the off weeks, you're planning the next webinar. In other words, you're sending them, you're bringing a content marketer side by side with them and they're interviewing them. And the content marketer is going and building the deck, the first draft of the deck of what they're going to talk about in the webinar and running the interview. And you perhaps bring in people from your sales team so they're involved as moderators. So your prospects and clients see that your whole client-facing team is actively involved in this education initiative. And over time, you'll have successful clients and channel partners that you could bring in as additional subject matter experts on these podcast interviews and these live streams and in these webinars. And that helps to continue to demonstrate this expertise to the CTOs, to the facilities directors, whoever else you're looking to build these relationships with when it comes to demonstrating your expertise about anything and everything having to do with immersion cooling in AI and data center and high performance computing environments. And this alone, getting the right people to spend more time with your team in a context where they see your team as experts and not just another vendors, will do wonders as a branding and an indoctrination tool. Will do wonders at helping your team to be able to frame the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different competitive options that are in front of them. will do wonders to make sure that you cover as many of those 28 touch points as possible, to monopolize the coverage, to create so much amazing immersive experiences. Bad pun, right? Immersive experiences, immersive cooling, right? To create these immersive events and educational events where you're spending so much time with your best prospects that there's no reason for them to look elsewhere for this education, because you've done such a great job throughout the full buyer's journey. So you're not only guaranteeing that you're on the short list, in some cases you can do this so well that your team is effectively knocked out the competitive alternatives on the short list by the time they get to the decision stage and they're ready for a sales conversation. They're ready for proof of concept, demo, whatever in the buyer's journey makes the most sense when you're confident that they're at the 83% point or past the 83% point, and finally ready to learn more about your company's unique approach to delivering immersion cooling, rather than just the broad-based problems, the broad-based goals, the broad-based challenges that you've identified in doing the customer insight research. But at the end of the day, if you're serious about growing your immersion cooling business in and around the data center industry, in and around high-performance computing environments, focus on what they care about, what's top of mind for them, meet them where they are. That will not only ensure that you are leading the conversation about what the priorities should be, but helps to educate and build trust at scale, and leans into the way that modern humans are navigating the buyer's journey, researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing. And when you do this well, many times you will completely leave in the dust and make irrelevant some of the other competitive alternatives that may have seemed like a big barrier when you first got started, but all of a sudden now, because multiple stakeholders from their decision committee have spent several hours with your company learning about all of the issues that they should be thinking about at the intersection of their business and immersion cooling, all of a sudden now it's a complete game changer for growing your immersion cooling business. So that is the final question that we'll have time to address in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live stream. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We are all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming live streams like this and similar educational resources and webinars, make sure that you subscribe to our weekly email newsletter that comes to your inbox every Sunday. You can sign up for the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter by going to www.dcsmi.com/newsletter. Until next time, we wish you great success in growing your data center career, your team's influence, and your company's influence in and around the data center industry. Take care now and have a great week.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.